Good morning, class. This is ECON 512, Introduction to International Trade. The class will cover the second of chapter 6 of your textbook. Remember that in this chapter, we are going to evaluate and also analyze the tariffs. Tariffs are the import tax imposed by the government. So the subtopic of today's discussion is the gains and cost of tariffs. So the first issue is who gains from foreign direct investment to trade and increasing returns from the evidence. The pharmacies for international trade and welfare cost of tariffs. Here are the class video clips.
Okay, today we're going to show how to analyze international trade using supply and demand, and then we're going to use the same tools to show the welfare costs of tariffs. Okay, let's get right into it. Here is the domestic supply curve. This is the supply curve of the home country firms. If we're thinking about the U.S., this is the supply curve from U.S. firms. Here's the demand curve, domestic demand. This is demand from U.S. consumers. If we had no international trade, then as usual, we would find the equilibrium where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. That will give us the price with no international trade, and the quantity both produced and consumed with no international trade down here. Now let us suppose that the consumers in this country can go out into the world and they can buy as much of these semiconductors as they want at the world price. So in that case, if we had complete free trade, consumers would be able to buy as much as they want at the world price, or as given by this world supply curve. The free trade equilibrium then would involve greater consumption. That is, at the high price, with no international trade, the quantity demanded is here. With international trade, consumers get to buy at the lower world price, so their quantity demanded increases. In terms of the diagram, the quantity demanded will increase to QD free trade. So domestic consumption is equal to this distance, or domestic consumption is equal to the quantity demanded with free trade. Now what about production? Well, the domestic producers can only charge as much as the world producers. They can't charge a higher price. So when the world price falls, when domestic consumers are able to buy at the world price, domestic producers, they can only sell at the world price, and they're going to be less willing to sell. So the domestic production will fall. Domestic production will fall to this lower amount right here. At a lower price, the domestic suppliers are only willing to produce a less amount or a lower amount as given by QS free trade. Now notice that domestic consumption is QD free trade, domestic production is QS free trade, and demanders are demanding more than the domestic suppliers are willing to supply. The difference, of course, is made up by imports. So with trade, domestic consumption will be at QD free trade. Some of that will come from imports, and some of that will come from domestic suppliers. Okay. That's it. That's our analysis of international trade using supply and demand. Now make sure you understand each step in this diagram, because in the next slide, when we're going to add tariffs, it's going to make the diagram more complicated. Each step is actually pretty simple. Each step is actually no different than the ones we've already done, but the diagram will look a little bit messier. So if you need to, go through this slide again to make sure you understand each step along the way. Okay, now let's do the same diagram, but now we're going to do it with a tax or a tariff. Let's remember that here is the quantity demanded with free trade. Here is the quantity supplied with free trade. The difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied domestically is, of course, imports. So this is imports with free trade, this distance right here. Now, a tariff is simply a tax on imports. So what the tariff does is it raises the world price by the amount of the tariff or the tax. So the world supply curve or the world price shifts up until we get to the new equilibrium. Of course, what this means is that at a higher price, domestic consumers are going to demand a lower quantity. So domestic consumption falls from Q free trade to Q quantity demanded with the tariff. Domestic production falls by this amount, or let's just add that to the diagram. Domestic consumption falls from here to here. Okay. What about domestic production? Well, with the higher price, domestic suppliers are now willing to supply more. Here is the price of the world price. Here's the world price. With a higher world price, domestic suppliers are willing to supply more up until this point. So let's add that to the diagram. So domestic production is going to increase from the quantity supplied with free trade to the quantity supplied with the tariff, or again, just putting that into the diagram, it's going to increase from here to here along the domestic supply curve. Well, what about imports? Well, imports, remember, are the difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. The quantity demanded with the tariff is here, the quantity supplied is here, so imports are the difference, which is this distance right here. So notice that imports have fallen. Final thing to add, a tariff is just a tax on imports. This is the quantity of imports. This is the amount of the tax or the tariff. So the tariff will also generate some revenues. This is the revenue from the tariff, which is going to go to the government. It's the tax or the tariff amount times the quantity of imports with the tariff. So this is revenue which flows to the government. Okay, that's it. That's analysis of tariffs. Now what I want to do is say, well, what are the welfare consequences of this? And the welfare consequences are going to depend upon this factor, the domestic consumption falling, and this factor, the domestic production, increasing. Let's take a closer look. Okay, let's take a look at the welfare costs. And here I'm going to look at the net costs. What I mean by that is we could actually find the costs in two different ways. We could look at the costs and the benefits to the consumers, the costs and benefits to the producers, costs and benefits to government. We could sum all those up. That would give us the net cost. I want to jump straight to the net welfare costs of protectionism, and I'm going to do that by focusing on the real factors which change. And these are two. First, domestic consumption, as I said, falls. Second, domestic production increases. Notice I haven't said here anything about the revenue from the tariff. That's because that's a cost to consumers. They've got to pay more, but it's a benefit to the government. They have this revenue that nets out, so it's not going to affect the net welfare. Instead, the net welfare is going to depend upon these two real changes. And what I'm going to show is that both of these effects, somewhat surprisingly, reduce welfare. Why is this? Well, domestic consumption falls. The reason that reduces welfare is because there are lost gains from trade. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Second, domestic production increases. You might think that's a good thing, except, however, we're going to have wasted resources because the domestic producers have higher costs than the world producers. So on a net level, there's going to be more resources go into production than are necessary. There's going to be wasted resources. Can we measure the value of these losses? In fact, we can, and I'll show that in the next slide in a little bit more detail. In order to focus on the welfare costs, I'm going to make two simplifying assumptions. First, I'm going to assume that the world price is so low that if there were complete free trade, there would be no domestic supply whatsoever. So think about a good like sugar. If we had complete free trade in sugar, we in the United States would probably import all of our sugar. It's simply much more expensive to produce sugar in Florida than it is to produce sugar in a country such as Brazil. The problem is that in Florida, the opportunity cost of land is very high, and the climate in Florida is not ideal for growing sugar, so you have to invest more real resources to produce sugar in Florida than you do to produce sugar in Brazil. So if we had complete free trade, there would be no domestic supply. I'm also going to assume that with the tariff or the tax, that it raises the cost of imports so much that there are no imports, that it's simply too expensive to import the good. Again, this is actually quite accurate, or it's quite similar to what we have for the case of sugar. So with this very high tariff, the entire domestic consumption is produced by domestic suppliers. So our tariff equilibrium is given by this point, and notice that domestic consumption is lower. Okay, so what are the costs of the tariff? Well, there are two. First of all, the lost gains from trade. So the demand curve can be read as the willingness to pay. This is the willingness to pay for sugar by domestic consumers. The world supply curve can be read as the cost of producing sugar. This is the price at which world suppliers are willing to supply the sugar. So there's lots of gains from trade here. Consumers are willing to pay more than the suppliers and the world suppliers require in order to produce the good. So by getting together, the consumers and the world suppliers can earn these gains from trade. With the tariff, however, that's not possible. With the tariff, we have reduced consumption. And with that reduced consumption is lost gains from trade given by this purple area. What else? Well, the U.S. supply curve can be read as U.S. costs. So what happens with the tariff is that instead of producing the sugar in Brazil, where it's cheap to produce sugar, we produce the sugar in Florida, where it's expensive to produce sugar, where we have to invest more real resources in producing sugar. We've got to invest more in irrigation, more in valuable land, more in fertilizer. So these are wasted resources. When the domestic industry expands because of the tariff, we invest more resources in producing sugar than are necessary. It would be cheaper. We would be able to import sugar using fewer resources. We would be able to produce that sugar internationally using fewer resources than we can produce it in the United States. So by what the tariff does is it switches production from the low-cost world producers to the high-cost domestic producers, and that generates wasted resources. Now, in fact, with these numbers, we can calculate the sizes or the amount of these wasted resources. And what economists do quite often is they make assumptions about these supply curves and these demand curves, and they can make some of these calculations. Let's take a quick look. So with these numbers, we can calculate these areas. This triangle, for example, is half base times height. So the base is 20. This is a base of 20. The height is 20 minus 9. There's a 20. There's a 9. So the area of the triangle is half base times height, or 1.1 billion. What about the deadweight loss triangle? You do the same calculation. It's 0.22 billion. So with these kind of numbers, we could find out that the costs of the sugar tariff are 1.32 billion. And economists do these kinds of calculations all the time. Okay, let's summarize and point out some further reading. First, tariffs increase prices to consumers, so domestic consumption falls, and that creates a deadweight loss. Second, tariffs divert production from low-cost world producers to high-cost domestic producers, and that wastes resources. Now, I haven't said much here about the distribution of the losses and gains, exactly who benefits and who loses. Let me give you just a short story. Tariffs are bad for consumers who have to pay more. They're good for domestic producers who gets to expand production. They're bad overall precisely because of these two reasons which I've just described. If you want to look in more detail, I focused on the bad overall. If you want more detail on dividing it between consumers and producers and the political economy of this, take a look at lots of different textbooks, but the one, of course, I would recommend, Cowan and Tabarrok, Modern Principles of Economics. That'll go into more detail on their distribution. Thanks.
Let's look at a brief history of just how much the shipping container has boosted world trade. What we've learned from studying the data is just how much the shipping container was a big breakthrough, arguably the big breakthrough, in the post-World War II expansion of global trade. This is a technological innovation which consumers generally do not handle directly, and probably they don't think very much about, but it really has been quite significant. A key feature of the shipping container is not just the container itself, but its standardization. It's made it possible to have standard operating procedures for loading materials on and off of boats, running ports, and facilitating logistics, and this has made trade much easier to handle. The hard part about a lot of international trade is not shipping the goods across the ocean, but rather processing them when they're being packed up and processing them again when they're being unloaded. A big part of the gains from shipping containers have been their ability to support and induce a coordinated system involving cranes, ports, and storage, again with this key property of standardization, making it much easier to load and unload goods. A primary entrepreneur behind shipping containers, by the way, was an American, Malcolm McLean. He was a trucking magnate, and he first tried out the idea in 1956. Prior to shipping containers, which allowed for standardization and also machine-operated ports to a greater degree, a lot of the loading and unloading was done by dock workers. That cost a lot of money, and it also involved a lot of management problems and coordination and information problems as well. You don't actually see many workers in this picture, and today, quite often, a port is a pretty quiet place. This whole idea spread pretty rapidly and pretty fundamentally. So in 1966, just 1% of all countries had ports which could handle shipping containers. By 1983, that had gone up to about 90%. And it's astonishing how much port labor productivity rose in places where shipping containers were instituted. So for instance, in 1965, we have measurements of port labor productivity being 1.7 tons per hour. By 1970, a mere 5 years later, we have measurements where port labor productivity is about 30 tons per hour. Of course, that's a very significant increase. The best numerical estimate we have looks at 22 industrialized countries and finds that shipping containers explain a 790% of increase in trade over the first 20 years of their use. That estimate is found by comparing places which had introduced shipping containers and what their growth in trade was as compared to places which didn't, or which did only later on. And even if that's an estimate on the high side, scholars are in general agreed that the technology of shipping containers has driven a much bigger increase than, say, bilateral free trade agreements. And according to the same measurements, those bilateral free trade agreements would account for a 45% increase in world trade over that same period. And of course, that's a much smaller growth than what we've gotten from the shipping containers. Above all, I think of the shipping container story as a tale of just how subtle and indirect and maybe hard to observe important innovations can be. Anyway, for sources to read more, there's a very good piece in the magazine The Economist. This should be online. The main empirical results discussed here are taken from this paper, which is a working paper on shipping containers. There's a whole book, very good to read, by Mark Levinson. It's called The Box. It's basically the history of the shipping container. And not so much on shipping containers, but on trade and transport costs more generally. I would recommend this piece by David Hummels, and that's available online. Now let's consider some general points as to who gains from foreign direct investment, or FDI, and who would also gain from having more of it. And let's start with the very beautiful country of New Zealand. New Zealand is unfortunately very far away from a lot of the rest of the world, including some of the world's wealthiest countries. And just as there is a gravity equation, which means that international trade declines with distance in a nonlinear manner, so is there a gravity equation for foreign direct investment. New Zealand, in proportional terms, does not receive nearly as much foreign direct investment as does, say, Canada. So let's do an imaginary thought experiment here and ask what would happen if somehow, geographically speaking, New Zealand were as close to the rest of the world as is Canada. Well, New Zealand would get more FDI, more foreign investment, and according to one estimate, real wages in New Zealand would rise by about 70%. That's a big effect, but note that New Zealand, for a developed country, is actually relatively poor, and it turns out that distance, and thus lack of trade opportunities, is one significant reason for that. Again, if you can imagine a New Zealand which is closer to the rest of the world, their intermediate goods or inputs would be cheaper, their technologies would be better, and the country would have higher exports, all leading to greater wealth and higher real wages. On this point, there's a very well-known piece here, which you can read online. New Zealand aside, a more general point here is that multinationals raise the gains from trade, and the gains from trade and the gains from foreign direct investment, well, those two things interact. And one way to think of it is to realize that intra-firm trade, that is allocation of resources within the multinational, they allow for the relatively cheap importation of inputs from other countries through the multinational, and in turn that helps a nation export. You might ask a related question, and that is, which country has relatively low gains from doing foreign direct investment? And at least in a fairly static model, the answer, which may surprise many people, is the United States, USA. Think of how this works, again sticking with a fairly standard model. Well, foreign direct investment, that reallocates production away from home, which to some extent can hurt the United States. It's also the case that by doing foreign direct investment, the United States, which is a technology leader, it shares its technologies with others, and that helps the growth of other countries. And by sharing its technologies with others, the United States actually is worsening its own terms of trade. Of course, there are profits and other gains from those foreign direct investments, but overall, when you add all these things up within a standard static model, what's surprising is that the gains to the United States from multinationals and foreign direct investment are really quite low. They're not much greater than zero. And this is very much in contrast to a standard popular claim that the United States or other wealthy large nations with a lot of multinationals, that somehow they're ripping off the rest of the world, while standard economic analysis seems to imply that exactly the opposite is going on, that most of the gains are, in proportional terms, reaped by smaller countries. Now you'll notice that I've been referring to a static model, and I think it's absolutely correct that in a more dynamic model, the U.S. does reap greater gains from having foreign direct investment and multinational corporations. To take a simple example pictured here, it's much easier to produce and market an iPhone and bring that product to fruition when you can have a multinational corporation which is dealing with Taiwan, Philippines, and China and assembling the iPhone at much lower cost. So multinationals make the United States much more innovative, and some static models will miss this, but keep in mind these innovations also tend to be public goods for the world as a whole, and although they do benefit the United States, having, for instance, iPhones and smartphones is a benefit to a large number of people around the entire globe. For the empirics discussed in this video and for a general theoretical background, including an important discussion of how trade and multinational corporations interact, I very much recommend this well-known piece by Raimondo and Rodriguez-Clare, listed here and available online.
Now let's look at the evidence on how much the idea of increasing returns explains the content and structure of world trade. Just to review, the notion of increasing returns to scale suggests that something gets cheaper at the margin as you do more of it. This can be applied to the level of the firm, to the industry, or even a geographic region. And again, here we're comparing a factor endowments view to an IRS, or increasing returns to scale view.
The factor endowments view is saying that a region has some significant advantage accumulated ex ante, such as having a lot of labor, which then makes it easier to export goods which are produced by a lot of labor. The increasing returns to scale stories are more of an ex post view, that is, you end up being good at something because you started doing that. Note that the increasing returns to scale view in general will require some extent of market or monopoly power, whereas the factor endowments view can be made consistent with either perfect competition or market power. We can look at possible predictions of increasing returns to scale theories in 6 different areas. The first is intra-industry trade. There's then the fact that similar countries tend to trade a lot with each other, that the gravity equation fits the data well, looking at firm-level evidence, whether or not there is a home market effect, and finally the issue of path dependence in response to shocks. By the way, for much of the structure of this discussion, I'm relying on an online handout from David Donaldson at MIT, which you can find online here. Let's first consider intra-industry trade. For instance, you can imagine that Great Britain is selling, say, white shirts to India, and India is in turn selling colored or flowered shirts to Great Britain. You might think that each country has simply specialized in one kind of shirt, and it would seem that differing factor intensities are not explaining the fact that there is trade in shirts running both ways. But over time, the Heckscher-Ohlin or factor intensity theories, they made a comeback on this point. If you develop a Heckscher-Ohlin theory, but you allow the 2 countries to have different technologies, then you can, in fact, within a factor intensities framework, get this two-way trade across nations within a given sector. Intra-industry trade may also be the result of factors which are neither increasing returns to scale nor factor intensities, and in general on this whole point, there's a very good article by Donald Davis. Similar countries trade a lot with each other, such as the United States and Canada pictured here. At first glance, this would appear to be inconsistent with a factor intensities approach, because the factor intensities approach at least appears to suggest you get a lot of trade when the countries are very different. But again, if you modify the assumption of an identical technology within the factor intensities approach, it turns out that that too is quite consistent with the notion of similar countries trading a lot with each other. And on this point, do see our videos on the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. The so-called gravity equation seems to explain a great deal, and some economists believe that this is more readily compatible with an increasing returns to scale approach than with an approach which emphasizes factor intensities. To the extent that trade across great distances really is costly, you might think, well, this requires some strongly differentiated products to get that trade off the ground. But again, while this evidence is certainly consistent with increasing returns to scale theories, it's also consistent with the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem and factor intensity approaches, where you have factor endowments driving specialization. To sum up these first 3 areas in maybe a single point, what we're seeing in the data is very strong evidence for specialization, but specialization here is the key, and specialization is not identical with increasing returns to scale. You can get specialization also from factor intensity approaches, again relaxing this assumption of identical technologies. There's a fourth source of evidence on behalf of increasing returns to scale theories, and this is somewhat more illustrative, and that is what is called firm-level evidence. So rather than looking at different industries or sectors, let's look at the behavior of individual firms, and we find a number of results which appear to suggest that in the arena of international trade, there's a lot of market power. So for instance, markups are falling with foreign competition. Import competing firms are cutting back their production when foreign competition goes up. And all in all, when you look at the entire package of propositions you see about individual firm behavior, this does seem to be fairly compatible with a model of monopolistic competition and differentiated products. Perhaps the most convincing piece of evidence from my point of view is the literature on what are called home market effects. And that literature suggests that countries which have a large home market for a good are also the countries which tend to export that good. Think of that large home market as having given the country a start in an area, and then because of increasing returns at either the firm or the industry level, well, the country becomes better and better at producing that good or service, and that eventually leads to export success. A simple example is that both Hollywood and Bollywood have large domestic markets for movies, and they have ended up being very successful exporters. The French at home drink a lot of wine, and they've ended up being fairly successful at exporting that wine. If you go to Germany, you'll see a lot of fancy kitchen stores with really sharp knives. And again, Germany has become a successful exporter in that area. The large home market effect is by no means always present, but we do see it a lot in the data, and I would recommend you take a look at these two pieces, both available online. Yet another way to think about increasing returns to scale theories is to ask questions about path dependence. So for instance, do regions get nudged off increasing returns to scale paths, or do they bounce back? If you view productive success as being the result of basic fundamental endowments which are not going away, you would think that if a country or region gets nudged off a path, that will end up mean reverting and getting back on that same production path. Alternatively, if you think it's a matter of accumulated experience based only on some very small initial advantage, you might think it's easier for a region or sector to get nudged off its path of success. If we look at cities which have been bombed, it seems that over time they revert back to where they would have been had the bombing not occurred, at least in terms of overall economic activity. So today in Japan, both Hiroshima and Nagasaki are fairly successful, fairly productive cities. It seems they had good factor endowments, and they managed to keep that advantage and then rebuild. The point that urban bombing shows a lot of mean reversion, and thus to some extent supports factor endowment theories, you'll see that discussed and illustrated in these pieces here. In other areas of urban history, we find examples where that initial nudge really seems to matter, and the importance of that nudge seems to persist. Memphis became a major American city at first because of its location on the Mississippi River. That location is no longer so important, but Memphis remains important as a city in Tennessee to this day, in part because it had such a significant early head start. On these nudge effects for cities, you should read Bleakley and Lynn, Portage and Path Dependence. One thing that's interesting about these urban literatures and these urban examples is that you're starting to see ways in which trade theory and economic geography, or location theory, actually overlap quite closely. So to sum up, it seems that increasing returns definitely matter for explaining international trade. There are some areas where there appears to be an observational equivalence between increasing returns theories and factor endowment theories, so we're still not sure how much, but pretty much everyone agrees increasing returns are a very important idea for explaining the structure and content of cross-national and cross-regional trade. In this unit, we're going to unlearn two myths about multinational corporations. Maybe these aren't myths that you yourself believe, but still it might be useful to set out more explicitly exactly why they're wrong. Sometimes it's argued that the very largest multinational corporations are much bigger than countries. Let's see how this argument goes. Well, if we take the company of Apple, right now, as of mid-2012, their market capitalization is somewhat over $500 billion, which of course is a very large sum. Apple is a large company, and right now they're the largest company in the United States and the largest real private sector company in the world. But here's where the mistake comes in. You could take some countries that have GDPs of at or a bit below 500 billion, and those countries would include Poland, Belgium, Sweden, Switzerland, and people are sometimes tempted to conclude that Apple, as an economic entity, is larger or more important than those countries because the market capitalization of Apple, somewhat over 500 billion, is greater than a lot of those GDPs. But that is a mistake. It's a mistake because it's confusing stocks and flows. GDP is essentially a flow. It's the value of goods and services produced in a year in a given country. So very roughly you can think of GDP as something happening at a particular point in time, a stream of goods and services. Capitalization of a company is a stock. It's the expectations about the total amount of value embedded in that country across many future years. So if Apple has a market capitalization of about 500 billion, well, that's the stock. The flow of sales through Apple in, say, 2011, that was a little bit over 100 billion. That's still very large, but you can see that for Apple, the flow is much less than the stock, just as in this picture, the flow of water is much less than the body of water, which you can think of as the stock. So if you're comparing the capitalization of a company to the GDP of a country, you are in essence confusing stocks and flows. It should not come as a surprise that in many instances the stock will be measured as larger than the flow, but that doesn't mean that Apple as an economic entity is more important than, say, Belgium or Sweden. Our second issue is quite distinct. This comes up when you find individuals in very poor countries who are working in the factories of multinationals. It may be the case that many of these individuals are paid no more than a few dollars a day. Observers look at these situations, and very frequently they call it exploitation, that you could have a multinational company which is so wealthy and perhaps so profitable, and it's paying its workers such small amounts. Now, this is very often a moral argument, and economics per se cannot evaluate moral arguments, whether they're right or wrong. But nonetheless, understanding the world through an economic lens can help you frame moral arguments in different ways. So the original view was that the multinational corporation is exploiting the poor worker by paying that worker just a few dollars a day. An alternative view, suggested by economic reasoning, is to wonder if there is exploitation in this situation. Maybe the problem isn't the company paying the worker, but perhaps the problem is that there aren't more companies paying the workers. Let's look at this in more detail. If you look at the nation of Singapore, in the 1960s, Singapore was not a wealthy place. Its workers were paid very small sums of money, and sometimes the workers were paid small sums of money by multinational corporations. Nonetheless, the leadership of Singapore decided that it would open up the country to foreign investment and protect the rights of foreign investors and create a favorable tax and regulatory environment. And over the next few decades, there was a lot more foreign investment in Singapore. What happened to all that exploitation? Well, it went away. Today, Singapore is an extremely wealthy place, and in fact, in terms of per capita income, Singapore is now wealthier than the United States. Looking at Singapore helps us shift our perspective. The exploitation problem is not the foreign investors you have. If there is an exploitation problem, you can think of it in terms of the foreign investors you do not have. Or let's look at an area where multinational investors have gone away. In the country of Haiti, there is a town, Jérémie, on this part right near the water on the northern coast. And in former times, Jérémie was well known for attracting a lot of foreign investment and some factories run by multinationals, including Walt Disney. These factories paid low wages, but still, an awful lot of Haitians were quite happy to work there because it was higher wages than they could earn on their own. Unfortunately, over time, most of these factories went away. The Haitians had a good reputation as workers, but there were problems with the electricity, problems with political order, problems with corruption at the port, and in general, Haiti, over considerable periods of time, was becoming a poorer country and a less well-run country. So the multinationals leave this part of Haiti, and over time, what can we say? Well, maybe you could say the exploitation went away, but is that really the correct way to think about it? The developmental path of Jérémie would have been much brighter if over the last few decades it had been gaining multinational investors.
I'm back in my special shirt on location to talk about international trade. Before we talk about the costs of interfering with international trade, let's make sure we're clear on where the benefits from international trade come from. Let's look back at the graph that we used for a closed economy. Suppose we're in France and we're looking at the market for this product. Do you remember what it's called? That's right, it's a pomelo. We've got a supply curve for pomelos in France and a demand curve for pomelos that tell us how many pomelos the French people want to buy at different prices. Now, if we have a closed market for pomelos, the equilibrium point will be where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. Here's the price, P star in equilibrium. Here's the quantity, Q star in equilibrium. Well, how much economic value is created in this market? Can you identify the consumer surplus? The consumer surplus is the area above P star and below the demand curve. Where's the producer surplus? The producer surplus is the area below P star and above the blue supply curve. The total economic value created in a closed economy is the area between the demand curve, which represents economic benefit, and above the supply curve, which represents economic cost. Between these two curves is the difference between benefit and cost, or economic value, for this entire market. Suppose now that we introduce international trade. And in the case of the pomelo, we're going to allow France to import this fruit at a lower price from the rest of the world, from outside the market. So let's put in the lower price for pomelos, P sub W, and at this lower price, people in France can buy as many pomelos as they want, and farmers in France can only charge this price if they produce pomelos domestically. With international trade, we think of the red curve as domestic demand, the blue curve as domestic supply, or the cost of producing pomelos domestically. And we realize that all trades that take place have to take place at the world price, PW, because no customer is going to pay a higher price when they can import the good at a lower price from somewhere else. That means the farmers in France cannot charge a higher price. They must charge the world price. At this lower world price, how much consumer surplus is created? See if you can identify the area that represents total consumer surplus when people in France can import pomelos at this low world price. In order to identify the total amount of consumer surplus created, start by finding the total quantity of pomelos demanded at the world price. That's going to be following PW over to the demand curve. Here's the quantity demanded domestically. With people buying this large quantity of pomelos at the price PW, consumer surplus is now the area underneath the demand curve and above PW. That is, it's this entire big triangle. How much producer surplus is now available with international trade? To calculate the total amount of producer surplus, follow PW over to the supply curve to remind yourself what the quantity supplied domestically is. Producers are able to charge PW, and their costs are represented by the height of the blue line, the supply curve. Producer surplus with international trade will be this small triangle that is below the world price and above the cost of making pomelos domestically. What is the total amount of economic value created in this market when international trade is available? It will be the sum of the consumer surplus, this large triangle, and the small triangle of producer surplus. Now, here's a question. Has the total amount of economic value increased because of international trade, or has it not increased? The answer is it has increased, and let's see if we can show why. First of all, notice that as the price falls from P star to PW, as the import opportunity lowers the price of pomelos, the amount of producer surplus created in France for the producers of pomelos domestically, that quantity shrinks, and it shrinks by the amount of this rectangle. The lower price means that a lot of producers in France are going to drop out of the market for pomelos. They're no longer going to produce them. So we have a shrinkage of domestic supply, a reduction in the quantity supplied domestically. Also, because the price is lower, even those farmers that are still in the market, still able to produce pomelos, are earning less revenue. They're making less money. Instead of earning this large price for pomelos, they're getting a small price. So there is a smaller amount of surplus for them, even on the pomelos they're still making. So this entire trapezoid, this area right here, is producer surplus that is no longer available. That is, producer surplus that has been destroyed for French farmers by the fact that imports are now replacing their business. However, the amount of consumer surplus that's created is this very large trapezoid. With the lower price, consumers are ecstatic because they're getting a great bargain, and a lot of consumers are now going to buy pomelos who couldn't afford them or chose not to buy them before. Not only are more customers in the market for pomelos, but even those customers that were buying pomelos at the high price, they're even getting an extra advantage because they're able to get their pomelos at a discount. That is, the price is falling, adding to their consumer surplus. The total increase in consumer surplus is this large trapezoid here. Notice, the large trapezoid, which represents the increased consumer surplus, completely offsets the loss of producer surplus. That is, this small trapezoid lies entirely within the big trapezoid. The net gain for the economy in France, the net gain is the area of this triangle, the triangle that's below the old equilibrium down to the import price. You can think of this triangle as equal to the quantity of imports multiplied by the difference between the old price and the new price, multiplied by 1/2. That is, this rectangle represents the gains from trade. The difference between the additional consumer surplus, or the benefit that consumers get from buying low-price pomelos, and the loss to producers of losing a market. If you subtract the lost producer surplus from the gain in consumer surplus, you get the gain from trade. That is what's left over. And it's always going to be positive.
Now let's consider some brief theoretical points on how trade, investment, and migration can be substitutes for each other. In a lot of international economics, there are three core mechanisms. The first is trade in goods, the second is movement of capital, in some cases called outsourcing, and the third is migration of labor. The point here simply is that we need to keep all three in mind at once. Having all three of these mechanisms may limit the ability of politicians to control economies. For instance, let's say that tariffs go up. That may indeed restrict imports, but in response, foreign investment will go up too. So if you consider the 1980s, the United States placed restrictions on Japanese automobiles coming into the United States, implicit import quotas, and the response is that the Japanese built automobile factories in the American states of Kentucky and Tennessee. This may have been a more costly or inefficient response, but still it meant that the initial trade restrictions didn't actually have such a major impact on longer-term automobile prices in the United States. Or here's another mechanism of potential substitution. Let's say, for instance, that policymakers decide to limit immigration into their country. Well, if fewer immigrants come, what then happens is that outsourcing is likely to go up. So, for instance, if the United States takes in fewer engineers from India, it's more likely the case those engineers will stay in India, produce something in India, and then sell it using information technology to the United States. In other words, simply limiting immigration does not necessarily restrict foreign competition as much as it may seem at first. Policymakers may also try to limit outsourcing. For instance, take the case of Indian call centers. Now, this is arguably the policy change that's hardest to implement. It's very difficult to stop people from trading over the internet, but just as a thought experiment, imagine that we can to some extent limit outsourcing to India. One longer-term response would be that Indian immigration, including immigration to the United States, would go up, and of course some of this may include illegal immigration. So again, there are many levers in international economics, and this includes the movement of goods, the movement of capital, and also the movement of people. And these multiple levers will limit the powers of policymakers. For instance, wages are higher in the United States than in India. Over time, this wage differential can be reduced by, again, movement of goods, movement of capital, or movement of people. These multiple levers make it harder for policymakers to reduce the narrowing of the wage differential over time.
Today we're going to look at the benefits of product variety and the effect of international trade on variety. People are different. Tastes differ. Even for a good as simple as peanut butter. Some people like crunchy peanut butter. Other people like it smooth. Some people like it salty. Other people prefer it sweet. We can think about welfare as declining the further away a good is from a person's tastes, in some kind of taste space. So more goods means that a person is more likely to find a good which is closer or closest to their particular type of taste. So variety can bring a lot of benefits. Of course, variety can sometimes also be a little bit confusing or overwhelming, especially if it's a good for which we don't care much about. Some people don't even care much about peanut butter, so the variety of peanut butter can be a little bit overwhelming. But usually, variety is a small price to pay in order to better match our taste with products. More products, more variety is also beneficial for producer goods, for intermediate goods. These are some goods from orthopedic surgery, for example. A long time ago, we used to just use, a hammer and chisel. Now we have more specialized, more designed goods, which are more specific and more tailored to a particular job, and that increases productivity. So more variety means closer to a person's tastes, and more variety means higher productivity for a particular task. So why can't consumers and producers have exactly their most desired good? The reason is that for many goods, there are economies of scale, and this means there's a trade-off between variety and average cost. So for many goods, the cost of producing the good falls the greater the number of goods which are produced. The cost per unit, or the average cost, falls the greater the quantity produced. So this means that if every individual had exactly the good which they most desired, the average cost would be very high. Instead, we accept a trade-off. We produce fewer varieties. Each one of those varieties, we produce a greater quantity, pushing the average cost down. One of the great benefits of international trade is it makes the trade-off between variety and average cost easier to bear. We can get more variety at lower cost. I'm going to give a simple example from Militz and Treffler. Let's build this example with some assumptions. Suppose it takes 4 workers to design an automobile. And once designed, let's suppose it takes 1 worker to build an automobile. There are 2 countries, and each country has 12 workers. So let's look at one of these countries. It's got 12 workers. What are the things that country can produce? What are the production possibilities for the country with 12 workers? So, assume now there's no trade. Well, one thing a country could do is have 4 workers to design a single automobile, then have 8 workers producing automobiles, so you end up with 8 automobiles of one type of variety. Another thing you could do is to have 2 sets of 4 designers. Remember, it takes 4 workers to design an automobile. So that'll get you 2 designs. Then you've got 4 workers left over, so you can have 2 units of each designer, 2 units of 2 varieties. Okay. Now, what can we do with trade? Well, with trade, suppose we do the following. We now have we'll look at both countries. Let's suppose each country specializes. Country 1 has the green specialization, and therefore workers produce one variety, of which they then produce 8 units of that variety. The other, the blues, therefore workers design one variety, and they produce 8 units of that variety. So far it's the same situation as A, this situation here. But now with trade, suppose that they trade 4 units of one variety for 4 units of the other variety. What ends up to be the case then? Each country has 8 units of 2 varieties. So notice that with trade, the countries are better off. So compared to situation A, in which there was 8 units of one variety, each country now has 8 units of 2 varieties. Compared with situation B, in which there were 2 units of 2 varieties, that is 4 units overall, we now have 4 units of 2 varieties, that is 8 units overall. So we've got, compared to one situation, we've got more variety. Compared to the other situation, we've got more units. Either way, we are better off. Big advantage of international trade, increases variety. So I cheated a little bit on the last slide, and I want to say how. I showed you on the last slide that international trade could lead to a better trade-off between variety and average cost, could get us more variety at lower average cost. But I didn't provide a mechanism for how markets would make that happen. I didn't show you how the free market could or would lead to that particular outcome. And this turns out to be quite a difficult problem. So when lots of firms have these declining average cost curves, it turns out to be quite difficult to figure out how the market will trade off variety with average cost, how the market process will result in that particular outcome. There are, in fact, a variety of theories along these lines. All fall under the title of monopolistic competition. By the way, Paul Krugman, who did pioneering work in this area, sometimes it's said, well, what did Paul Krugman get the Nobel Prize for? And people say, well, he got it for showing that international trade also has the benefit of providing lots of variety. And people would say, well, what was so hard about that? Who didn't know that? You get more variety when you import goods. Well, that's only partially true. What he really did was to show how the economics of monopolistic competition would lead to a process such that international trade would generate you a better variety average cost trade-off. He explained how the market process would work. That turned out to be quite a difficult problem, which is why he got the Nobel Prize for it. The mathematics are quite complicated. I'm going to give you some of the intuition in a later slide. Here's another interesting point about globalization and variety. I've said that globalization increases variety, but actually globalization reduces geographic variety. More places start to look the same at the same time as it increases preference variety, or the variety actually available to individuals. Let's go back to our earlier example. Suppose we have no trade and we have these 2 countries. Well, now a traveler, a tourist, going from the green country to the blue country will say, look how different they do things here. They're blue here and my home country is green. And a blue traveler going to the green country will say, wow, look how different things are here. They've got green here. In my own country, they've got blue. But remember what trade does. With international trade, you've got a swap of blues and greens, and now a traveler going from one country to the other will say, well, they've got blues and greens here just like they have in my home country. So geographic variety declines. However, for people, for individuals, every individual in the world now has greater access to variety. And that's really what we care about. We care not that places are different, but that people have access to many different tastes and experiences. By the way, Tyler Cowen made this very clearly in his excellent book, In Praise of Commercial Culture. Tyler pointed out that what globalization does is it makes China, brings KFC to China at the same time as there are great Chinese restaurants in the United States. So China and the United States begin to look a little bit more similar, even though Chinese and Americans both benefit from globalization bringing greater variety to their countries. Some estimates have been made of the benefits to increased variety, and they turn out to be quite substantial. So from 1972 to 2001, the number of product varieties imported into the United States increased by a factor of 3. And by one calculation, consumers would be willing to pay 2.6% of their income to buy in the larger 2001 supermarket than from the smaller 1972 supermarket. 2.6% of their income just from more variety. That's pretty big. And remember, increased variety also benefits producers by giving them access to tools which are more precisely tuned to exactly the job that they want to do. So it increases productivity. This has been less well estimated, but I think it's also important in my view. Okay, here's some further readings, most of which can easily be found on the web. This is Paul Krugman's 1979 piece, Increasing Returns, Monopolistic Competition in International Trade. It's the piece which made Krugman's reputation and was a foundation for a lot of his Nobel Prize work. An excellent review of some of this material is in Molitz and Daniel Treffler, Gains from Trade When Firms Matter. You can find that free on the web. It's from the Journal of Economic Perspectives. It's a very accessible paper. Estimating the gains from more product variety, Broda and Weinstein. Quite a difficult paper, but a worthwhile one to read. And of course, don't forget Tyler Cowen's excellent book, In Praise of Commercial Culture. Many good reasons to read that book. Thanks.
Now let's consider something called the gravity equation, and this is aimed toward trying to understand why the costs of trade are often so high. We have something called the gravity equation in physics, and this is stipulating, among other things, that the further away two objects are from each other, the weaker the attraction. For economics, our gravity equation is going to say the further away are two countries, the weaker the trade attraction. Now let's consider a very simple form of a gravity equation, just so you get a sense of how it works. On the left-hand side, we have trade, which is what we're trying to explain. That's the quantity of trade, and it's between nations I and nations J, as represented by the subscripts here. On the right-hand side, you can, in simple versions, treat this G as a simple constant. On top, you have M sub I times M sub J. Think of that as the size of one economy multiplied by the size of the other. So in general, in gravity equations, the larger the economies you're dealing with, the less distance is going to matter. And then on the bottom, we have D, the all-important distance, and that's the distance between country I and country J, again represented by the subscript here. As distance increases, trade does go down, but in more complicated forms of a gravity equation, this is often something exponential, so you could imagine it being d squared or d to the 1.25 or whatever, and those would indicate that as distance increases, the possibility of trade is increasingly decaying, the costs of trade are becoming increasingly larger at a faster rate. Empirically, consider this graph here. The horizontal axis is basically telling you how large a country is in economic terms. The vertical axis is basically telling you how much that country trades with the United States. As shown here, well, which are the two countries trading the most with the United States? There is Canada and there is Mexico. But if you ask how large are those economies, well, they're not especially large compared to a lot of other places. Why are they trading so much with the United States? Well, it seems at least one big reason is because they are so close. If you're wondering how gravity approaches fit into the broader picture of international trade, they are actually consistent with a lot of different international trade theories, such as increasing returns or the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. So finding for the importance of gravity doesn't rule out the relevance of any of these theorems, but still it can be said to the extent that gravity theories of trade matter, that means an underlying model of international trade probably does require some specialization, because if trade costs are really that high, well, then you need specialization to be getting trade off the ground at all. And let's take a look at just how high the costs of trade seem to be in the gravity literature, and let's start with industrialized countries. To take one known estimate, again for developed nations, from Anderson and Wynkoop, the costs of trade across borders are on average about 170%. Of that sum, they estimate that about 21% is transportation costs, about 44% is border-related costs, having to deal with paperwork or bureaucracy or tariffs or different cultures or different regulatory standards. And indeed, breaking down that 44%, they find 8% a policy barrier, 7% a language barrier, 14% a different currency barrier, 6% an information cost barrier, 3% a security barrier. But again, these are just averages. These are examples giving you one way of thinking about where some of these gravity costs come from. Finally, again, according to Anderson and Wynkoop, 55% of that 170% is coming from retail and wholesale margins as trade crosses barriers. And by the way, if you're wondering how that all adds up, you can see it's given by this equation here. One quite striking result we learned from the gravity literature is that overall, tariffs are a relatively small barrier to trade, especially once we get past agriculture or outside of the very most protectionist countries such as North Korea. Overall, most of the costs of international trade come from other obstacles in having to cross borders. And you'll note those numbers come from developed countries, which on average tend to be more efficient and better at trading. For developing countries, trade costs can actually be at least 2 times higher. We also find empirically that trade costs vary with the product line, and they can vary by a factor of 10 or more. It really does depend what you're trading, and these numbers are just estimates, just averages. Early in this video, we offered a very simple form of a gravity equation, but actually the more accurate forms of gravity equation define distance costs relative to available alternatives. So let's consider a comparison here using data from the 1990s, and on one side of the comparison stands Australia and New Zealand, and on the other stands Austria and Portugal, both of course in Europe. Comparing these 4 nations, well, Australia and New Zealand are roughly the same distance apart as are Austria and Portugal. Furthermore, if you're taking the product of the size of the economies or the GDPs, again, this comparison you will get something pretty close to equality. And yet there's quite a striking truth here. In 1993, Australia-New Zealand trade is about 9 times greater than the trade between Portugal and Austria. Why is that? Well, Austria and Portugal are both located in Europe, and they have nearby a lot of other countries to trade with. Australia and New Zealand are much more isolated, relatively speaking, in the Pacific, and thus they end up trading much more with each other because they have fewer other natural trade partners. Here's the comparison. Let's take within the United States the average of state-to-state trade, and we're going to divide that by the average state-to-province trade, where by province we mean Canadian province, and on average that figure is about 1.5. So that means a given U.S. state is more likely to be trading with another U.S. state than with a Canadian province, but only by about 50%. From a Canadian perspective, a similar ratio will look quite different. So let's take the average province-to-province trade, and this is within Canada, and divide that by the average state, meaning U.S. state, to Canadian province trade. And there the ratio is much larger. It's quite striking. It's going to be 16.4 times higher. That is, a given Canadian province is way more likely to be trading with another Canadian province than with a U.S. state. But why are these 2 ratios so different? Consider some comparative statics. Say we start with a case where there are no costs of trade at all across borders, and then we introduce some kind of trade barrier which makes it harder to consummate these exchanges. As a result, both Canada and the United States would trade more with themselves, that is, they would trade more internally rather than exporting and importing, but in proportional terms, this is going to be a larger effect for the smaller, more open economy, namely Canada. This is part of a broader and more general truth that simply any increase in trade costs will have a larger impact on the smaller and more open countries. Let's think this through with a simple example using tourists. Here's the U.S.-Canada border as represented at Niagara Falls. Right now it's pretty easy to cross that border, but let's say it became a lot more difficult. The lines were longer, or a passport cost more to get, or security procedures would be tougher. How would this have differential effects on the United States and Canada? Well, the United States is a larger economic unit, so it's the case that in proportional terms, we have more United States citizens taking their vacations already within the United States. So if passport costs go up, this has a moderate effect, but actually tourist sites in the United States do not become that much more crowded. Canada is a smaller and more open economy, so proportionally speaking, more of its citizens are traveling abroad. As passport costs go up, more of those citizens stay in Canada, and that will make Canadian tourist sites much more crowded. So here we have higher passport costs, meaning that Canada gets much more internal tourism, or you could say much more internal trade, and the higher passport costs mean the United States, the larger country economically speaking, is only getting a bit more internal tourism and a bit more internal trade. That's all just another way of thinking about how the gravity equation works. Another way to put this is simply to note that in more sophisticated forms of the gravity equation, relative trade barriers are what matter, not just absolute distance. For core readings on the gravity equation and how it's applied, I would very much recommend all of these sources, the bottom being you can simply Google gravity equation trade. Here are also some other reasons on the gravity equation approach. These are important articles, but they're also more technical or more difficult, and I would recommend them only to more advanced students of this topic.